Welcome. Hello, everyone. It is lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us for this Indigo Hack and Learn Show and Tell session. You're all really welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're joined by participants who are spread all over the world, and we're also interested to hear who we've got on the line. So it would be lovely if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Please let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. My name is Eleanor Carter. I'm Research Director for the Government Outcomes Lab team here at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. And I'm a big fan of INDIGO, INDIGO being the International Network for Data on Impact and Government Outcomes. And what brings us together is a belief that better data can deliver better outcomes. So really excited to be here and talk a little bit more about what this data might mean for improving outcomes. This session today is running as part of our Social Outcomes Conference. So we are joined by people who participated in the Hack and Learn over the past 2 weeks, but we might also have a few people on the line from the wider conference who are newer to the INDIGO datasets and are newer to the format of a Hack and Learn. So welcome everyone. I should let you know that we're recording the session and we'll make the video available online, and that the slides from the session are also going to be available on the GoLab website. So we have a really fantastic group of contributors to share their insights and ideas with us today. And we also have a couple of great respondents on the line. So I'd particularly like to welcome Toby Phillips. So Toby is the Executive Director of the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker. So thanks for joining us, Toby. Toby's going to be commenting and giving feedback on the first two presentations. We're really pleased to welcome Leandro Bongalupe, who's at the University of Toronto, but formerly with INSPA. Welcome, Leandro. Great to have you with us. And Swati is soon to be joining us. Swati Shresht is the Research Director for the Centre for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University. So we're looking forward to her joining us too. So a brief recap. What is a Hack and Learn? What have we been doing over the past 2 weeks? So the idea of this Hack and Learn event is to bring together policymakers, decision makers who have real challenging questions and an ambition to improve social outcomes. They've got specific questions, and they work with coders and data enthusiasts who can help answer those questions with data. So we have had a series of challenge teams focused on particular questions and issues working together over just 2 weeks, I should say, to begin to explore ideas and answers with data. So we invited the teams to work with the INDIGO database system and datasets, but not to be constrained by that. So we've got lots of different datasets that are being used, and we can explore those together in the session today. A format note on our session today, we'll move through, on the next slide, we'll have our agenda. So before we kick off with the presentations, I'll pass to Juliana, who will give us a bit more of an introduction to INDIGO and the aims of our Hack and Learn. And then we'll move through for the presentations from each of the hack teams, getting feedback from our respondents as we go. There's a little bit of time for questions and answers at the end, but I'd suggest that people pop their questions in the chat as we go through, as we've got a pretty packed schedule, and then maybe the hack teams can respond to those questions in the chat as we go through to have a more lively discussion as we move through the sessions. So if you have a question for the teams, please do write those in the chat. Great. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Juliana.
Thank you, El. Well, hi, everybody. It's really, really exciting to see you all here. I've been interacting and working with many of you over these past 2 weeks, and I'm really, really looking forward to your presentations. But before that, there are 2 messages that I would like to share with you before. As El was explaining, this session is part of the Social Outcomes Conference, so it may be the case that this is the first time for many people to know about INDIGO or to interact with INDIGO, so I want to refresh that message. As you know, our INDIGO initiative, which you are all part now, is about better data for better social outcomes. We are a community of practitioners, researchers, policymakers, or even data enthusiasts who share an interest in sharing data about social outcomes. And we do so because we are convinced that better data will generate better insights, and better insights will then help us design better programs. So that's our main objective here. Next slide, please. And we tend to describe our initiative in 3 different buckets. So the first one is the community part, which is really, really important for us because we don't want to be just the host of the datasets. We just don't want to be the website that has the interesting datasets. We really want the community to take advantage of them and to use them and reuse them. So we have a very diverse and broad community spread across the world, as you can see in this map, that is really at the core of our initiative. Our second bucket is the system. We have a quarterly system for data sharing, and different organizations and different practitioners who are involved and worked with impact bond projects are sharing data with us, and we use and reuse that data, and then we share it with you. And many of the teams that are part of our Hack and Learn have been working with this data. So our system of data sharing is really important for us. And our last bucket is the data bucket, which is the key of our work, and we are hosting 5 different data sets in our website. They are all open for open consumption of everybody who is interested in this. Our impact bond data set is our flagship data set, but we have more data sets which are about, one of them is our impact wayfinder. We have another data set about the alignment of social outcomes and the SDGs, and we also have a data set about outcome funds across the world. So that is our INDIGO initiative. The community is really important for us, and that is why this Hack and Learn is really at the core of our initiative. We have been working for 2 weeks, and you have been working really, really hard. I can attest to that. We have been communicating using Slack channels, and it was really great to see that Slack was live at every hour of the day, as we have many people from many different zones. There were always messages and always new data visualizations to look at our Slack channels. And this is just a brief proof of that. And I think you all did a great job. So that's why I'm really, really looking forward for your presentations. And I want to see what you've been up to. And there is a great panel of experts, practitioners, and researchers who will be giving feedback for you, so you can keep working on these issues. And then it's over to Elle again.
Fantastic. Thanks, Juliana. And it's my pleasure to introduce the feedback from the first challenge team, who focused on an impact bond pipeline or project development nursery. So I think it's Ian for feedback from this group. Over to you, Ian.
Yeah, I think Gillian's actually going to start this one, if you want.
Hi, everyone. Gillian Woodley from South Africa here. Okay, there's the slides. So yes, we were given a brief of developing a pipeline of impact bonds. So specifically, this focused in Israel, where there were about a dozen impact bonds. There was data collected from a Google survey, and then a spreadsheet which had a list of variables and different data definitions. So what we were tasked with working on is a pipeline report and a pipeline prototype site. This data would be used by decision makers who are involved in SERPs, such as investors, outcome payers, and practitioners. Next. So yes, as you can see, the data was collected through a survey. That was the information data given to the stakeholders in Israel who were in charge of the impact bonds. Step 2 was our report design. So we just brainstormed, we spoke through our Slack channel, like Juliana mentioned. It was just a mash of ideas there, and we came up with some really creative things during the process. And our result is as follows. So we've put together a prototype report based on the impact bond pipelines, developing a type of nursery, and we came up with the following visualizations of data. So firstly, we'd do a kind of GIS mapping one of the data pieces that we had there was latitude and longitude coordinates. So using those, and we'd be able to develop a picture of where the locations are, of where the impact bonds are taking place. So we are thinking longer term, mapping it out globally. So not just in Israel, which was the country that we had in our case study. The second data visualization that we had was a pipeline of how things would move across the nursery. So on the extreme left here, you have an idea bank. So this is where your concepts just come up. You think of an impact bond. It's not really kicked off yet. It's just something that's been spoken about. Next, it moves into early stage. This is where you put together your feasibility studies, you do your initial cost estimates, put together your numbers concerning the problem that you want to deal with. Then it goes into mid stage where you are probably getting your approvals and different signatures from your different stakeholders involved. And lastly, it moves to end stage, where we classified it as code green, where everything's in place. You just need your final small details to go through, and then your impact bond will go live. So this is how we thought it will be useful for decision makers to just get a snapshot of the impact bond pipeline, and see exactly what stage they're in and what requirements they need. Our third data visualization was by priority area and sector. So the ones we identified in our data set were across education, gender, criminal justice, health and employment and training, among others. And we thought we could link this to the to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. This also ties into our fourth visualization, which is where we do a Sankey diagram and show how all of these SERPs contribute to the different SDGs. Passing on to Ian now. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. And to give a kind of live moving visualization, I don't know how many of you have seen the SIB evolution animation on the GoLab website, but I would thoroughly recommend going to see it. It's a great resource, and I just dropped the URL into the chat box for that visualization. So this is really based around that. So that rather sketchy diagram that I did, my tech and art skills aren't as great as they could be, would visualize a service which is ready to go, ready to be implemented using social impact investment. And the grey circle in the middle would be the name of the project, some basic data pulled through from the data sheets, the kind of stuff that you see in the rest of that slide there and on Excel sheets. And each of the circles would represent different partners. So the pink one would be the outcome payer, the green ones might be investors, the blue might be an intermediary if there's one, yellow might be the delivery organisations. And that shows you what a service ready to be delivered and agreed with all parties would look like. And then services in the pipeline would start with that grey circle in the middle with the basic information of name of project and country and data. And then other circles would be added as conversations begin with outcome payers or with investors or with delivery organisations. And initially those would be conversations, and there would be a dotted line from the circle from the periphery to the centre. And as that party makes their commitment to definitely go ahead with this, and that becomes a solid line, and gradually you see a service emerging visually. And you could add dates to that to give a sense of time and time span for the development. And then it would become a fully developed service. And we had some data to work with, as Gillian mentioned, thanks to Social Finance Israel, around a number of services. One there you see on the screen for employment of single mothers. There's one around integration for Arab population, high tech, prevention of childhood obesity, and a number of others. And we're grateful to Social Finance Israel for that data to begin to work with. But that would give us a kind of a visualization. And if you look at the animation on the URL I just dropped into the chat, you'll see that it's actually 3D. It's a really powerful way to capture the development of a project. If you can move on to the next slide. Oh, and the next one. Yeah. So we need to obviously do more work on the actual, the user experience, the colours, designs, and that kind of thing. But we also need to think about the data definitions and when we move a project out of pipeline and into the main database, and potentially when we move a project out of the pipeline and the database into an archive because it hasn't proceeded. And I think that's quite important because there can be all sorts of reasons why it didn't proceed, but they're not necessarily because it was a bad idea. It could just be a little politics. It could be various things that happen. And you can learn as much from something that didn't happen sometimes as you can from the services that did proceed. And I think that's important to bear in mind. And that means that the pipeline then becomes, for me, is one of the powerful things about a pipeline database. It becomes a platform for peer learning in real time and networking and learning from each other. I think that's a really powerful part of what the pipeline can be. And as it says there, we'll have a pipeline data set in due course, thanks to the work with Liliana and various other people that are much more technically accomplished than I will ever be. But thank you for the chance to share that thinking with you.
Great, thanks so much, Gillian and Ian. It was lovely to hear your reflections from the past 2 weeks. Before I pass to Toby, I would like to move on to our next challenge team to present. So Hack Team 13 had the challenge of aligning outcomes to sustainable development goals. So over to you, Hack Team 13.
Hello everyone, I'm Ikshita, and Arunama and I are going to present what we have done over the past few weeks. So basically what our challenge was to match social outcome metrics with the sustainable development goal number that fits that metric. Next slide. Right. So now let's dive into what we actually did. So our work was to go through the given outcome definition and then match the primary and, if there was one, a secondary SDG goal corresponding to it. So we divided the outcomes amongst ourselves as a team. So essentially what we did was a data entry task, but trust me, it wasn't as straightforward as it would sound. As you will see in the forthcoming slides, some outcomes can be linked to one SDG, whereas others can be linked to several. Handing over to Arunama now.
Thank you, Ipsita. So the first part of our results. So before we discuss this, due to a time constraint, we did not have time to work on all of the policies. So as far as I remember correctly, we decided to narrow our focus and efforts to child and family welfare, health, education, and employment and training. So as Ipsita mentioned, what we essentially did was collect data, upload them, and build the Sankey diagrams that you can see on the screen. And again, as Ipsita said, we found out that there were no straightforward solutions or alignments between certain social outcomes and SDGs, especially as you can see when it came to child and family welfare. But we did see that policies related to health had clear alignments. So can we please go to the next slide? Yeah. So the education policy sector was seen to align with the SDGs. And if you go to the link, just let me just paste it to the chat once, just a second. Yeah. Yeah, so if you go to the link, you can see the live Sankey diagram, which is super cool. Can we please go to the next slide? Yeah, as for the, I think Ipsita is, I can cover this. So as we mentioned previously, the education policy sector was seen to align with the SDGs, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I just got confused. Yeah, and yeah, so like we saw the Sankey diagrams on the previous slides, we came to the conclusion that in addition to its anticipated goals, certain projects could also fulfill goals from the goals other than their sector. So to give an example, we found out that certain projects, say that have their main or primary sector as employment, could also be fulfilling as education focused goals. Can we please go to the next slide? So previously there were no SDG filters. So having one was definitely a good idea. So you can filter projects based on alignments with certain SDGs, depending on the kind of project or the kind of outcome that you would want to be working on. Next slide, please. Yeah, over to Ipsita.
Right. Okay, so through the previous hack and learns and this hack and learn, we could complete the following sectors. We could complete employment and training, education, health, and child and family welfare. But we have a long way to go, and we have sectors like criminal justice, agriculture and environment, homelessness, and poverty reduction left. So we hope to complete it through, the coming hack and learn. And yeah, we can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, everyone loves a Sankey, right? They're definitely one of the most compelling visualizations, I think, when you have this blurriness across the different outcome measures and the SDGs. Thank you. Toby, could I come to you for some comments? Thanks so much for joining us, Toby. I know it's really late at night, but we're all keen to hear your reflections.
Thanks, Elle, and yeah, greetings everyone from Melbourne in Australia. I think just taking them in order, on the first presentation, I really like that idea of producing what I took to be like an automated report from the database, because I think I think that's something that decision makers will need. Like there are some places in policy world where you still can't beat like a PDF. And so I think, as great as the database is, if you've got some kind of automated report production, that's great. And in the project that I'm running, where we collect COVID data about policies around the world, we actually produce monthly reports on what's happening in different regions, like what's happening in Asia, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the Americas, and we do that manually. But right at the moment, we're actually trying to develop ways to produce the reports in an automated way, pulling from the database. So I kind of love the concept. I think the data visualization, like by stages of development, is really good, and the map as well. And I think that the standardization of the data is key in something like that pipeline nursery. So for kind of everything we're describing, you need a clear taxonomy and code book. And so like clearly you had that for, say, the stages of progress through the nursery. So you had like the definition of the idea bank to the mid stage to the end stage. And I think, perhaps what to think about is in developing it further is like what questions might someone want about the pipeline or projects in the pipeline, and kind of anticipate those questions and think about how do we structure a taxonomy to answer that. And so, I thought there were some interesting reflections at the end there about not every project gets up, and would it be possible to develop a taxonomy of what those barriers are? So, whether it's lack of funding, that's quite straightforward, but whether it's sort of not having local implementation partners, whether there's some sort of political barriers, a standardized taxonomy around that would then help users aggregate the data, and you could create summary statistics to answer those kinds of questions. I think moving on to the second group, matching the outcome metrics to SDGs, definitely sympathize that sounded like a really hard project, because the SDGs are very broad and they overlap at the edges. And as you said, some projects will kind of contribute to multiple outcomes. So I'd probably think on that, where my mind went was thinking, what would a decision maker want? What would someone who's holding a budget or someone who's, a policymaker in a line area of a department who's trying to achieve an outcome, what would they find useful? And, it occurred to me that actually they may not want to interrogate this data set all on its own, but it would be very useful in combination with other data. So I actually thought it would be really useful paired with the first presentation about the pipeline nursery, which shows, which projects in the pipeline, how they're distributed across those SDG style outcomes, could help identify where there are gaps in what a government or an agency or an organization is funding, could help articulate co-benefits in a project. So it creates, if you like, I was saying before, for every dimension in that nursery, you want to have a clear taxonomy so that rather than having things described in plain text, you can have a code book that allows you to aggregate the data up. In some sense, matching the metrics to SDGs gives you that taxonomy. I mean, just again, to like briefly reflect on the project that I work on looking at COVID data, it's like every country has their own definition of like what's a stage 2 lockdown or a stage 3 lockdown. So we've developed our own taxonomy. We look at every country and we say, well, you call it a stage 2, we're calling it this, and that way we can make comparisons. In the same way, I think that's the beauty of the SDGs. It's like every project in every country might articulate their benefits in the same way, in a different way rather. And because they're all using different language, you can't aggregate them up. So I think the sort of the value and where I'd think about where to apply this SDG project is once you've mapped them out, you can use that as a filter or a layer on top of basically any other project to say, here we've got a consistent taxonomy to talk about what the benefits are and what the outcomes are here. So yeah, really two really exciting projects, and I look forward to seeing where they go in the future.
Thanks so much for those insights and reflections, Toby. That was really helpful. We should say thanks again. We appreciate how late it is for you. So if you need to get some rest, thank you.
I might sign off now, but it's been great. Thanks.
Thanks, Toby. I'd just like to encourage everyone, if you have questions or comments for the teams, please do post those into the chat. We've got such a packed schedule, so we can have a conversation there at the same time as moving through the presentations. Next up, I'd like to welcome another group supported by our great partners, INSPA. This challenge team focused on pilot projects and scale-ups. So it's over to you.
Hi, so our challenge was pilot projects and the scale-ups. Next slide, please. So whenever social impact bond practitioner decides to run a pilot project on a smaller scale, and then they test if it's sturdy enough to be scaled up. But next slide. But how do we know if the project has the power to go bigger and scale up in terms of target population, new geographies, etc.? Next slide. So to arrive at the conclusion about what's the difference, our group divided themselves into a team of 2 and compared the pilot project with the scaled up version and decided if there are any differences or not, and if there is a difference which exists, what are those? So now I'll hand over to Ikaro to talk more about our findings and way forward.
So hi everyone. So next slide, please. Okay, so after all this work, we compared our notes between the groups and we summarized our findings. So first of all, the scale-up projects, they do scale up. So they target more people, they take longer, and they are more expensive. And this is made possible because not only the investors in the pilot phase, they make a bigger economic commitment in the scale-up phase, but also new investors coming to this project. So basically, more capital translates into more work being done. So the second point is that we saw some differences in some of the projects between target population and the delivery location. And we hypothesize that this is probably because those projects, as they grow, they become more mature about the issue at hand, and also about the capabilities of the delivery services, the delivery organizations. And for example, the Pan London project, their scale-up phase in their scale-up phase, they narrowed down their target population, perhaps because they saw they were not capable of handling too much people, while the teen and toddlers project, they actually expanded its coverage. So in the next slide, we see the third point, that is the outcome metrics, they may also change. We saw this basically in two ways. One is that they can become simpler, so they may abandon unnecessary complexity, as the Panando project did, or they may simply follow other established protocols, just like the Teen and Toddlers project did. So we are not sure why these movements, they do happen, but we may theorize why this can happen with more data. And this is not the only uncertainty that we have. It's also inserting the situation around stakeholders. The fourth point is basically that we saw that some contracts, they have a few informations about the organizations around it. And we are not sure if this is due to a lack of information or if this is due to actual change, something like there are less organizations in new arranged contracts in the scale-up phase. And another point of doubt around these stakeholders is that we are not so sure about their categories. So, for example, the bridge fund management, in the pilot phase of a contract, he is an investor, and in the scale-up phase, they become an intermediary. So we are not sure which is the category of this particular organization. So to summarize all our findings, in these projects, when they scale up, they become bigger and more refined, but the information about the stakeholders is quite uncertain. So as you can see, our next steps, basically, they are gather more data about those pairs of projects, the pilots and scale-ups, and continuing our analysis. Also, we need to investigate projects that are pilots, but they did fail to scale up, and we need to know why they weren't able to scale up. And also interview managers that are involved with projects that have successfully scaled up. So they may provide us some answers about how to do so. So that's all. I thank you all for listening to us and welcome your questions and feedback.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Emi and Ikoro. That was a great presentation. And I really feel your pain in terms of understanding this messy scale-up space. That was a tough challenge. Thank you. Our next group, I love the title of this one, is about what is next after impact bonds. Exploring the OBC's alphabet soup. I love it. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. So in our challenge, we made an effort to explore the OBC's alphabet soup. So first, what are OBCs? OBCs are outcomes-based contracts, which are contracts targeting social environmental results with conditional payment to achievement of outcomes. We have some well-known examples, such as the social impact bonds and development impact bonds, but there are also the environmental impact bonds and sustainability-linked bonds, and maybe others. So in our challenge, we explored all these names, initials, and acronyms, trying to understand all this variety. Next slide, please. And our main questions were, how can we differentiate OBCs to properly understand what's new? And how can we find and use available information to better understand this variety? So trying to answer these questions, our team had a look at some examples from different types of OBCs, and we organized our findings in two groups. The first the first group, called impact bonds, has the contracts in which investors and outcome payers play different roles, such as social impact bonds, development impact bonds, hybrid social and development impact bond, and environmental impact bond, which is a specification for environmental outcomes. And the second group, that we call it others, in the absence of a better definition, is about the contracts that have investors and outcomes payers playing the same role, such as results-based financing and its variations, sustainability-linked bonds and ESG bonds. Next slide, please. So, to help us to read a contract and easily identify which type the contract is, we created this decision tree. And the main idea is, once you have an outcome-based contract, the first question that we need to do is, are there investors involved? If no, we have the simplest pay-for-success type of contract. But if yes, we have to do another question. Investors also play the role of outcome payers. If no, we have the impact bonds. And then we need to identify which type of impact bond. So we need to understand the nature of the outcome payer. If it is a government or a public agency, we have the social impact bonds. But if it is a multilateral or other organization that's not public, we have the development impact bond. And if we have both public and no public organizations, we have a hybrid impact bond, a hybrid SIB and DIB impact bond. And once we identified the type, we can ask if the outcomes are related to environmental impact. If yes, then we have the environmental impact bonds. But coming back to the second question and imagining that we had answered yes. So investors and outcome payers play the same role. So in this case, we have results-based financing, and then we can ask if the financing is made through bonds. If yes, we have the sustainability-linked bonds, and if the outcomes are related to ESG, we will have green bonds or ESG bond. Therefore, we can say that SLBs and ESG bonds are subcategories of RBFs, such as the environmental impact bonds is a subcategory of SIBs and DIBs. Next, please. So after doing this decision tree, we think that the next steps should be understand if this classification and decision tree really helps to identify the types of OBCs. So we need to return the data and try to apply this tool and observe if it is a better way to differentiate the contracts and if there is any novelty that wasn't incorporated, and then rethink the decision tree so you can come back to the data again and until you have a useful tool that really helps us to identify all these varieties. Thank you all for your attention and welcome to feedback and questions.
Thanks so much, Gabriela. There's actually another session at the conference tomorrow that I think might be interesting for you, where we talk about all of the different flavors and varieties of social outcomes contracting. And so certainly there are other people who are very interested in what's in the soup. Before we get proper feedback for you, we'll move on to the next challenge team. This team focused on CSR. Oh, no, that's not right, is it? It's time for feedback. Sorry, I'm so sorry. It's Leandro. It's your turn to comment on those past two groups. Sorry, Leandro, it's over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. You can call me Leo. It's easier and less complicated in English as well. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and thanks for inviting me. And thanks for the presenters for the wonderful job. I mean, I'll do some comments on both presentations and of course like highlighting parts that I found it very, very interesting. So I think for the first group specifically, I think this is a big question for all policymakers and for all people that are somehow interested on leveraging and developing more outcome-based contracts related to social and environmental aspects, right? So how do you actually scale them up? I think my idea of a SIB or a DIB is precisely to test in small scale and then see if it is working, use the data. I think somebody mentioned in the chat, I think it was Jan, that you have to learn from the data, good quality data on the initial phases of those type of interventions, understand what's actually going on, if possible, comparing with control groups or counterfactuals, randomized or as close as this as possible, and then from this on see the potential for scaling up. So I think this discussion was pretty much in your presentation. Both Fami and Ikaru mentioned that. One thing that I would like to see more, and I think it might be an interesting avenue to develop, is exploring a little bit more how much how much a project to be scalable should be the finance or the financial outcomes of it should be complement to the social and environmental outcomes instead of substitute. So I can think about some projects where, let's say, the government might save money by implementing a solution like that and then share back some of the savings with investors. So the Petersburg famous prison system as the first case, but many others. But there are other instances where like the outcomes are substitutes, right? You cannot charge the final user, you cannot necessarily generate any savings by implementing a project, and therefore this might hurdle a little bit the potential for scalability of this project or might impact its cost. So I think this dimension of complementarity and substitution between social and environmental outcomes with financial outcome might be an interesting avenue to pursue. Another comment that I think was very interesting on your presentation is the importance of stakeholders, right? So I think more and more in management, we have discussions about how organizations, for-profit, non-profit, or government might deal with the wide range of stakeholders that they have. And I think specifically on projects of this nature, understanding how stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement is key. I have some experience on designing and trying to implement a social impact bond in Brazil, and I can say by that if you forget one stakeholder from all the range of the ones that you're dealing with, it might collapse the whole project at a certain point. So I think this is very interesting to understand how you orchestrate and how you engage everybody in the same table. So wonderful ideas. With the second project, I echo the comments before. The title is very catchy and very is very interesting by itself, and I think it's a noble and a brave effort to try to develop a typology differentiating the different types of outcome-based contracts based on their characteristics. I'm not that sure if there are too much difference, but I really love the process modeling that you all performed, showing different steps and showing this what you call the decision tree on what would classify each one of those types. So that was amazing. One comment that I think it might be interesting to analyze is that sometimes names can be different, but the content itself can be the same. And sometimes those names might be different precisely because of legal framework that the different countries or different locations have, right? So I remember in Brazil, there was a lot of discussion on, we cannot call it necessarily a bond because this would imply falling into a different category, legal category that is not covered. So let's call it like a contract, social contract or something like that, that will enter another branch of the legal framework. So maybe considerations of that nature would be interesting. And and I think, honestly, I think for both analysis should be developed more and have interesting implications for policymakers, both to understand the degree to which projects can be or not scalable, the limitations of this, and also understand what are the typologies that are more related to what they are trying to implement on the ground. So I think definitely is an interesting first step that you all are doing, and I'm looking forward to see more developments of this nature. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Leo. They were really great reflections and certainly next steps encouraged. So it's really exciting to think too about how these projects can develop in the future. Now it's time for our next challenge team to take the floor. I'd like to invite the presentation from this group who focused on CSR data synchronization. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Victor Wamba from Democon. So we work on data synchronization and analysis. Next slide, please. The next slide. So the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy has collected CSR, corporate social responsibility data, for the years 2014 till 2019. CSR requires that businesses spread at least 2% of their very net profit of 3 years on CSS activities such as COVID, education, gender equity, poverty, and hunger. It's important to mention that since April 2014 in India, we're the first country around the world to make corporate social responsibility mandatory. So in India, there's not a database to refer for information. So the CSIP has to collect information on various categories related on CSR across India, and information such as net profit, spent, and sometimes there were information lacking or maybe some details. So our challenge was to standardize the data set so that in future use, this problem will not exist. So what we did, since the information about companies were spread across multiple sheets, the first thing we did was to combine the information of each year, the 4 sheets, into one using the corporate identification number, which is the unique across India, and then merge the 5-year sheets into one master data set. And we use tools like Tableau and Python to analyze and produce visualization. What we noticed that there were missing value on for some companies, or sometimes there were disparity between years, or maybe information like the model of implementation was written differently depending on the CSR. Next slide, please. So what are our findings? The first thing is that we have a data set with 18,710 companies, and around 32% had all data for the 5 years. 35 had data for 3 years, at least. Sometime 1 year was missing. So what we did was to take the average of the data available to fill the gaps to build this graph. Next one, please. As I was saying, in India, corporate social responsibility invite every company which has a net worth of around $70 million or a turnover of $140 million, or which make a net profit of $7,000 US dollar to spend 2,000 of the net profit on corporate social responsibility. And what we noticed is that those companies invest more than 2% of their net profit. The next one. And the project covers different sectors like education, healthcare, rural development, sector covered by the Sustainable Development Goal. We also noticed that there was many information not mentioned about the development sector. The next one. And concerning the mode of implementation, we noticed that the different companies implement directly the project on the field, or sometimes give it to some other implementing agencies. And many part of the time, the mode of implementation and development sector was not mentioned. The next one. This map shows the CSF funding across India, and we see that the southern part of the country is receive more funds than the north part. Why? The next one. It seems like there's a demand mismatch. Here we have the amount received by each state on the y-axis, and their per data GDP on the x-axis. Ideally, we should have a line with a negative slope. Low-income state receive high CSF fund, but we have a regression line with this positive slope, which shows that high-income states receive higher CSF fund, while poor states receive lower amounts. But it's not just that. The next one. We also discovered that rich states also get more funds, CSF funds, from other rich states than the low-income state. Next one. Here in the chart, we have the percentage of the CSA amount spent on the low-income state by the corporate state from the high-income state. If the value in the y-axis was 1, then the corporate of the high-income state are spending all their CSF fund in the low-income state. But it's not the case. We don't have an established trend on this regard yet. But we think that we can bridge the gap between the state only by increasing this metric, so that high-income state could invest more funds into lower-income state. The next one. But our suggestion to avoid to have gaps or missing value or empty value in the data set, the data should be validated before we add to the master data. To have the visualization in real time, we propose that maybe an application could be put in place. In terms of limitation, we only measure the inputs, the money spent, but not the outcome of the CSR project. Thank you.
Thank you for that detailed tour of the analysis. It was so powerful to see those striking statistics. Thank you for sharing that with us. We'll now pass on to the feedback from the next challenge team. So this group focused on COVID-19 and MPOs, looking at sectoral differences. So over to you guys.
Hello, everyone. Hi again. I'm Ishita, and Amy and I are going to present what we've done through the past few weeks. Next slide. Right. So our challenge was basically to identify and present the sectoral differences in the way that not-for-profit organizations have been impacted by COVID-19 in India. So basically, we did a very initial analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on the not-for-profit regular operations and funding. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Thank you. So now we're going to present our findings, but before that, let me give you a brief overview of the sample that we covered. So in our sample, we had 312 not-for-profit organizations. As you can see, a majority of the organizations belong to the healthcare and the education sector, but we also cover sectors like child rights and welfare, youth development, and women's empowerment, amongst a lot of others. Next slide. Okay, so the first question that we analyzed was whether the organization has made any change to the number of regular programs, events, or activities that they host due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over here, we see that most, like 120 organizations have suspended some programs, but they have added new ones, most probably in response to COVID-19, because it did require a lot of, new adjustments. Next slide. We can skip next slide. Right. So basically, we analyzed the challenges faced by the not-for-profit organizations, such as program execution, financial insecurity, employee safety, lack of digital infrastructure, remote team management, etc. There were a host of challenges that we analyzed. So now I'm going to present the ones I think are most important. So the first one here is program execution. As we see, the healthcare and education have the highest chunks because they are overrepresented in the sample. The total number of organizations which faced this challenge were 164 out of the 312 in the sample, which means a lot of organizations face this problem. I mean, and intuitively so, right? Because of the lockdowns, it made it harder to reach people on ground. So, which is why many organizations face this challenge. Next slide. Right. So the next challenge is financial insecurity. Again, education leads the pack, and closely followed by healthcare. And the total number of organizations which face this challenge are 151 out of the 312 in the sample. Next slide. Right. So the next one is employee safety. Over here, we see that healthcare leads the pack. Intuitively so, right? Because the healthcare workers were the frontline workers coming in contact with people from everywhere, so they were most prone to catching the virus, and which is why must have been a bigger problem for them. It is also closely followed by education, and then we have gender equality. And yeah, the total number of organizations which faced this challenge were 123 out of the 312 in the sample. Next slide. Okay, now handing over to Amy for the rest of the presentation.
So I'll present my findings on funding, and the first variable is status on the annual funding received. Here it's two categories, like lower than typically received, which is like 50.53%, and here the water and sanitation has impacted the most, followed by urban rural development and disaster relief. Next slide, please. And then this status of annual funding, which is like higher than typically received, it's like just 8.19% of the total organization. Here, financial inclusion is the leading the pack, followed by welfare and shelter for elderly and vocational training. Next slide, please. So now the second variable is cost-cutting measures adopted by the organization. Yes, for the yes category, there are like 65.71% of total organization. Here, like again, welfare and shelter for elderly is leading the pack, followed by animal welfare and environment protection. Next slide. The number of organizations which have not adopted any cost-cutting measures are like 24.36%. Here, financial inclusion is leading the pack, followed by promoting sports, music, and other talent, and vocational training. Next slide, please. So now this variable is like how many organizations have already run out of funds. It's like 11.54%. Here, it's most affected to the art and culture sector, followed by the disaster relief and environment protection. Next slide, please. So around 81.14% of the organizations thought that they need to change their funding strategy to cope up with the COVID-19 impact. And here, like again, water and sanitation is leading the pack, followed by financial inclusion and animal protection. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk about the impact on the funding of the regular program, which is negative impact, which affects 59.62% of the organization. Here, urban development is leading the pack, followed by livelihood and then art and culture. Next slide. So also there is a positive impact, but it's only for the 8.01% of the organization. Here, financial inclusion is leading the pack, followed by welfare and shelter for elderly and vocational training. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk about the challenges we faced during the while doing this over the last few weeks. So the organizations most of the time belong to more than one thematic area, which made it really hard to flesh out the absolute impact on sectors. And then there was like lots of missing values in the data. And here are some of the opportunities we have identified, which are like using machine learning programs. We can use this data to serve as a benchmark for problems which are faced by such organizations, and then like plan pilot intervention based on our analysis to create maximum impact by customizing it across sectors. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Ami and Ipsita. It was lovely to hear about that project. And it sounds like a challenging data set, but also one that gave you really rich insights. So thank you for talking us through that. It's now time for our final presentation. So this last group focused on generic drug repurposing and looked at a feasibility for crowd-funded cures. Over to this challenge team.
I'm sorry, I think...
Is Safa on the line?
Yeah, I think they didn't attend, and maybe it's because this team lives in New Zealand and it is like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning for them. So maybe they slept over.
Okay, so we're not going to have this final presentation. I think the time zone in New Zealand is a bit of a killer, but that means that I would like to pass to Swati. Swati, are you able to give some feedback on the previous two groups, please? Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks. Fascinating work. Really, I think they've done a very good job on the data set. I've actually had a look at one of them. So it's great they've been able to glean so much out of it. I was just interested, in the sectoral analysis. Were you able to look at any pre-COVID, trends? What was the total kind of funding that was going in? And then COVID, because we don't seem to have like a starting point, which is fine, because I think the data set may not have covered that, the pre-COVID situation. But I was just wondering if you came across those numbers in the data set. That's just a clarification. Should I finish my entire feedback?
Please do. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So that was just, a huge curiosity. I was also thinking that, I've been looking at your slide deck and it's really fascinating. There's so many, interesting, sometimes conflicting and contradictory data that's coming out. Did you ever wonder whether the lack of funds didn't actually have that much of an impact on implementation? Because it looks like, education and healthcare, they did have some amount of funding. They had to change the program a lot, but they were also the ones who were able to adapt quite a bit. And I think that's quite interesting because I haven't seen that kind of analysis in India, at least, that these were sectors that were impacted but could spring back. So that was a very interesting observation for me. For the CSR challenge, again, I think great work. This data, set had a lot of gaps. And again, the same question, did you run a trend before you did the, the correction that you did for the missing cases that you replaced by the average of the available data? It would just be fascinating to see, if the same trends came out before you plugged in the gaps, or were they slightly different. Again, the fact that it seems like the high income states are getting most of CSR data, again, intriguing, wondering if you had any thoughts about it, if you had any policy recommendation about it. I'm also wondering whether states are, or the companies are putting these funds in the state that they're actually in, or if there is some kind of an incentive to go and put these funds in some other state. But really, absolutely, fascinating numbers that have come. So I think those would just, I'll keep my comments short, but, 2 questions, and well done, both the groups, really amazing work. The visualization is great too.
Thank you so much, Swati. It's really great to have you on the line, and we love collaborating with you guys at Ashoka. So really grateful for the time and effort that all of those challenge teams put in over the last 2 weeks. What phenomenal analysis and lovely visualizations. I just wanted, you posed a few questions there, Swati. I wanted to give the challenge teams a chance to respond if they would like to. You might have other comments and want to read across the different challenge teams. So if you would like to come back with a response to any questions or any of the feedback, please do raise your hand and we can come to you. Victor, in particular, I know there were some tough questions in there from Swati. Would you like to come back on that?
But they're not tough questions. They're just curiosity. I was just so curious because, they have done such a good job of this data set that they make a lot of sense and a lot of time that they've been actually been able to get trends. So I'm just curious, that's all.
Of course.
We can take the question. Speaking to the first question of whether we had a benchmark, pre-COVID, we didn't, because the survey was floated out after COVID, so we didn't really have data on that. But it's definitely be interesting to see, the absolute impact on funding. This is something we, missed during the analysis. And speaking to the second question of, how healthcare and education have adapted, I think in India, the digital infrastructure was such that these 2 sectors, had to cope up the most with when, lockdowns were placed and when, when the pandemic hit in the beginning. So I think that funding, I think they also did see some increase in funding, and which would purely be because, they didn't have the infrastructure to begin with. So you did require a lot of investment, but I do, through the analysis, I did see that most of the organizations have performed much better than I expected them to. So yes, that's all I have to say. Amy, do you want to add something?
No, that's perfect. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, I can answer that for CSR data. So Swati, for the missing data points, we did take the averages, but that was done only for the companies where we had data for at least 3 or more than 3 years from the 5-year data that we had. So that filled a lot of gaps.
Thank you. Thanks for picking up on those questions and describing a bit more about the data. I get the impression that a lot of teams had to grapple with this challenge of missing data or slight mismatches. And I think that's a really common theme, but such important work to think creatively about how you can still put analysis and insights together, even in the face of some messy and incomplete data sets. So particular congratulations to those teams who worked through those issues. It's really impressive to see the visualizations that you put together. So to wrap up, I'd just like to express my thanks once again to all of the teams for coming, sharing their insights and being so generous in supporting one another across the past 2 weeks. But this is not really the end of the Hack and Learn because we'll have a social event next week. Do tune in for the chance to win the Indigo Cup. It's a cup for insight and idiosyncrasies, and more will be revealed in the social event. Juliana will be sharing details and an invite shortly, so tune in for some fun Indigo times. And we'll also be putting together a learning report. So if you'd like to write up the insights and the experience that you've had from joining in this Hack and Learn, then please do start jotting a few notes. What's it felt like? What were you surprised by? What are you most proud of in these visualizations that you've put together? We would love to capture that in this report. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us in this session. It has been lovely to share these times with you. So thanks, everyone, and see you all again very soon.
Thank you.